Before kick-off, a 0-0 draw in today's game at Villa Park would have been a really good result for Newcastle United. At full time, I'm not sure that's quite the case. This is my instant reaction. The game's just finished, so let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Before we get going, please do subscribe, hit the like button, all of that stuff. NUFC Transfer Daily will be back on Monday, but Newcastle finally kicked off their Premier League season, and I'm here to give my instant thoughts to the game at Aston Villa. And it's really a feeling of frustration. As I said on Friday's show, I would have taken the draw. I was expecting a draw and hoping for a draw if Newcastle turned up, stemmed the tide in the first 15 minutes and really went for it. And that's what they did in the game. I thought they did really well, and they were much better than Aston Villa. I haven't checked the stats, but Villa didn't have a shot at all in the first half. I don't think they had many clear-cut opportunities in the second half. It was all Newcastle creating opportunities, playing really well out wide in particular. The midfield was a little bit iffy, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but the underlying issue in this entire game was the lack of a goal scorer, the lack of somebody to put the ball in the back of the net, and it's really a massive shame that Newcastle have one sat at home at the moment, refusing to get involved. And I think that was the story of the game. The narrative all around kick-off, around last night's game for Liverpool, and then today's build-up in Aston Villa was Alexander Isak, and the game really showed why. The really frustrating thing, though, before we get into Isak and whether he would have played, I think the thing I would say is that he didn't have to be at his best. He could have probably announced that he would play on Friday, as lacking the sharpness that he is, and still scored one of those opportunities. It doesn't have to be. It didn't have to be Isak at his best. It didn't even necessarily have to be Isak. If Newcastle had signed Johan Wissa or any other striker this summer, and they were leading the line, Newcastle would have put one of those chances that they created away. Anthony Elanga had a decent game, missed a good opportunity in the first half that I think was probably harsh to expect him to score from there, because the angle was tightened by a good save by the keeper and a defender was on him as well. But that sort of set the tone for the game. Villa didn't really recover. Newcastle created opportunities, particularly out wide. I thought the defensively when Newcastle was superb as well. Dan Burn and Fabian Schär, who I predicted, I got the lineup pretty much. I think I did get it spot on, and I expected the pair of them to play at the back, and they really did excellently. There was no trouble in behind like there was back in April in the 4-1 defeat. I think Newcastle should count themselves a little bit unlucky that they didn't win the game in some senses, but they didn't put their chances away. They created enough, and the final ball wasn't there, and they didn't really look like they had enough conviction when the ball got into the final third, and I think that comes from the movement of a striker, the understanding the line leading of a striker. And when Will Asula came off the bench in the 90th minute, the one thing he did was get in behind and show for the ball and create a little chance for himself, and he shot, and it was blocked by Tyrone Mings. It's not that I'm saying Gordon didn't play well, but every single time he leads the line. I sort of said this a year ago back at the Everton game, I think September, October time, when it was a very similar game. Isak was injured, Gordon played down the middle, and Newcastle seriously lacked the conviction of a main striker. And I said after that game, I think I've probably even said it before, Asula should come in and start now, because at least the patterns of the play are still the same. At least the focal point is there, and it helps everybody else understand where they are. They had a lot of zip out wide in the build-up, and the build-up play was particularly good. They lacked in midfield, as I said. I think Joe Linton and Bruno weren't getting the game by the scruff of the neck, and Yuri Tielemans did really well in that area, and Boubacar Kamara, I think they actually probably won that bit. Tonali, for me, was the player of the match in behind, and he screened really well in front of the defence, and that helped Burn and Schär have a comfortable afternoon. Rodgers didn't get on the ball in those positions. There was a really good example of that when actually Rodgers did get in behind Kieran Trippier, and he was bearing down on goal, and then suddenly he just wasn't, because Tonali had got in there and stopped him. So all of that sort of stuff was really well done. I think, yes, they could have dominated the ball in the midfield and had a little bit more of an impact there, and Bruno could have done a little bit more. Joe Linton struggled to get himself into the game, but that's not really a surprise given that Newcastle, I think, had about 58 or 60% possession over the course of the game. So we know that he doesn't thrive in those environments, and the game did kind of pass him by at different points. I thought maybe that's a little bit harsh. Let me know in the comments what you thought. But that triangle of Cher, Burn and Tonali was why Newcastle were able to dominate the game and create those chances. That was the foundation. Barnes and Elanga were lively out wide with Trippier and Livramento on either side. So the chances were there, but it just came down to the lack of a goal scorer. And as I say, I think if Isak had decided he was playing on Friday and just turned up, he probably would have scored at least one of those opportunities, particularly in the first half. And it really screams that Newcastle need to sign a striker by the time they play Liverpool next week. Johan Wissa's obviously the man that they want. That's proving difficult. It's just about somebody to put the ball in the net, somebody to run the line the way that Asula did, the physicality that he showed. I mean, I'm not saying that he was brilliant, and it was telling that he came on at 90 minutes. You know, a couple of the questions in the Q&A that I did yesterday about Asula, what his role is, and Alex, again, who asked one of those questions, has just mentioned to me on Twitter before I came on that, you know, this is a question that we've got to ask about Asula. What role does he have if he's only coming on in 90 minutes when Newcastle haven't shown that they can score a goal, take one of those chances when they're carving them out? They're never going to get a better chance and a better performance at Villa Park. Villa were really off it, I thought. Didn't have the intensity that Unai Emery's team certainly usually does and definitely had back in April. Obviously, it's been a really difficult start to the season for them, and summer for them with their PSR problems. It was really telling that the whole entire fan base, by the sound of it, had a message for the Premier League with the chanting. But really, this was about Newcastle and the lack of goal scorer. So before kick-off, I absolutely would have taken this result. I think it would have been a very good result and a really good foundation. And there's lots of good things to build on, and it's a point on the board, and they can move on from this and absolutely take confidence. But given the red card, which came from a very similar moment where, you know, even though Villa play a low block, Newcastle got in behind a couple of times. Elanga I mentioned earlier, Gordon was bearing down on goal there as well, and Conte brought him down. It was a clear red card, but you would think from that moment Newcastle can go and break teams down. Obviously, it doesn't always work like that. Teams become actually more difficult to break down when they go down to 10 men because they become more compact and more. It's almost like in safety mode. That's the way they approach the game. There were opportunities there in that second half. Barnes, I thought, at crucial moments, he slipped into the second half at one stage. He shot over. There were just crosses into the box and crosses into areas where, if Isak was there, you know that he would have scored. If any sort of top level striker was there, you would have backed Newcastle to win the game. And this is the very first example, I think, already that Newcastle cannot sell Alexander Isak, because, you know, we've talked about the idea of finding a replacement. Gonzalo Ramos has been linked again over the last 24 hours. I'll talk more about that on Monday's Transfer Daily, but they already need Johan Wissa. Throw into that a replacement on the level of Isak, and as I say, Isak with any, you know, Isak's presence in that game probably gets them the win because of the movement that he has, the understanding that he has, the chance that Gordon had at the end where he peeled to the edge of the box, found the space, but he just wasn't ready. He just didn't have that sort of conviction. The biggest issue isn't Gordon in that role specifically, it's the impact that it has on the rest of the team. When the ball comes forward, you don't feel like they know quite what's clicking the way they do when Isak's there. Even when Isak was poor last season, everybody else knew what their job was around that, so it still felt like it was worth Isak playing at every single stage, even if he wasn't quite up to it at the end of the season. And I think that we've seen exactly the same. So it really does feel frustrating to come away from this game, despite that point, despite that foundation from which to build. Tonali being brilliant, the two defenders, we'll see, I'm sure, Malik Chow over the coming weeks get his opportunity, but Cher and Burn were phenomenal at the back. Nick Pope did really well as well, coming off his line and dominating, and shutting down the space. Villa didn't get any opportunity to get in behind in the way that they really did back in April, and that was the killer in that game. So yeah, I thought Newcastle were excellent today overall. That lack of goal scorer was the problem, and it really did hurt the team in quite a big way, I thought. So what happens now? Newcastle have to go and sign a striker. They cannot go into Liverpool and expect to get a good result next weekend, a week on Monday, with Gordon up front, because you would imagine that they'll have opportunities at the other end. I mean, Hugo Ekitike was excellent again last night. They created opportunities, and Newcastle will have opportunities at the other end. Liverpool's defensive frailties were evident at both the Community Shield and yesterday against Bournemouth. There's an opportunity to attack that, but Newcastle don't seem capable because Gordon is a great player and excellent in terms of his intelligence and his running and his pressing, and he leads the line in that sense quite well. But his movement, his understanding of where to be, but crucially, the understanding of the rest of the team of where they need to be around that is really where Newcastle lack when Gordon plays up front. That's why they look so toothless. It isn't just on Gordon, it's the rest of the team doesn't have the same focal point to play off. And you saw that in the 6 minutes that Will Asula had off the bench. He did something that Gordon hadn't done all game, which was run in behind, hold the ball up, create a little bit of space for himself and get a shot off. That's the sort of thing that happens when you have that focal point up front. So Gordon not playing means that Newcastle need to find a breakthrough with Alexander Isak this week, which seems all but impossible. I'm sure Eddie Howe will be speaking to the media, so by the time you're watching this you may hear him say once again that nothing's changed, because I'm sure he'll be asked. Or they need to sign a striker, and with Dango Ouattara going to Brentford, does that mean Yohan Wissa can now get the move to Newcastle? The suggestion is that Ouattara is a Mbumo replacement, so does that mean that Newcastle may have to look somewhere else? And this is the difficult thing. It's not about the quality. Yes, it would have been great if Isak played. I think if Isak plays, Newcastle win the game extremely comfortably. But it isn't just about it had to be Isak. The chances were there for any mainstream striker, and it just goes to show that even in this scenario, Gordon as a number 9 is just not the answer. He can play there. He has played there in his youth and throughout his time. Obviously, he played there for the England under-21s, but that was more as a sort of false 9. He wasn't doing the same job as he did and has done for Newcastle up front. So, yeah, a really good performance, a really encouraging performance, a result that you would have taken before the game. Newcastle fully deserved it. I think there was no point where you felt that Villa were really going to get the game away from Newcastle. There was a decent spell in the first 50 minutes of the second half, which you'd expect with Emery getting into them a bit, but it didn't really pay off beyond that. Newcastle gained the control even without the midfield. I think the other thing to say is that Villa really bypassed the midfield. They tried to get the ball over Newcastle's defence. They tried to get the ball into Newcastle's back line quite as often as they could to maybe get Rodgers on the turn feeding Watkins, and it didn't really work. You think against you would think against Liverpool next week there will be more of a midfield battle. So the midfield probably does need to step up a bit. Bruno needs to be a little bit more imposing. Joe Linton will probably thrive more because the game will be more to his liking in terms of a physical battle, something he can get his teeth into. We'll obviously have Jacob Ramsey in and around the squad at that point as well. I think we saw today in spells where Jacob Ramsey can help Newcastle progress a little bit with getting his foot on the ball, creating those opportunities that Joe Linton just doesn't look like he's capable of doing. This was not his best game, but again, it's not really surprising. So yeah, there's things to work on, mainly up front, and ultimately though, it isn't really a surprise. Newcastle have been through this last season. I'm saying very much the same thing as I was. We know that Will Asula isn't ready, and that's the thing. It's not saying just throw Asula in and it'll be fine. There will be different issues there because he isn't proven enough at that level. It's about bringing in a striker or getting, in a perfect world, Alexander Isak back on side. I'm sure, and I hope he feels a little bit guilty watching this game, knowing that really I think he was the reason Newcastle didn't get the win. Because if he starts, he scores in that game, Newcastle are celebrating 3 points, 3 huge points at a very, very difficult ground. But they can move on to Liverpool next week with a good foundation, and if they can get a striker in, they can be very confident of getting at what is quite a frail defence at the moment. Liverpool desperately need centre-backs. We'll obviously talk more about the Isak situation. We'll talk more about Gonzalo Ramos and other strikers and what will happen this week with the striker situation. But the big thing to take away from this game today is that it absolutely has to happen, and very quickly. Thanks so much for joining me on this instant reaction. As I say, I'll be back on Monday with a first episode of NUFC Transfer Daily. Like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you then. Cheers.